Thank you very much for inviting me. Now was instrumental in getting me here. We used to work together at King's College. I am a bit of a weird creature because I'm a visiting fellow at the university, but I'm at the same time working for the European institutions. So in the last, for the last 2 years, so my presentation may have been sort of colored by my new working environment. So I'll see how academic it is. What I'm presenting today is observations that I made in 7-8 years of research on risk and disaster management, drawing on 3 projects in particular. One is about flood management and the use of risk instruments such as flood hazard maps with different risk zones in different institutional settings. Another one is about, it was an EU FP7 funded project on responses to CBRN terrorism, so chemical, nuclear, biological, and radioactive attacks. But this is sort of less important for the presentation, but it's useful to understand the UK's way of defining resilience. And the third project, which I did at Louvain as my own grant, which was very nice, where I looked into security governance in France, the UK, and Germany. So, where I will proceed is that I'm going to give you a bit of background on academic debate and the conceptual basis around the concept of uncertainty and risk, and why it's such a challenge for governments to deal with it, and what kind of approaches have emerged. Then I'll sort of make my research question a bit more concrete by suggesting that it's necessary to analyze it from a comparative perspective, because different states, different institutional settings, that's the main hypothesis, lead to different ways of conceptualizing and designing risk instruments and using risk instruments and resilience policies. Then I'm going to go a bit into 2 different case studies comparing UK's and Germany's flood management and the use of risk instrument in that. And finally, I'm going to touch upon the security strategies of France and Germany and how they treat resilience. And then I go on. So uncertainty is basically what incomplete absence of knowledge about future happenings, events, processes. It has been understood as a problem for some time, and if you look back at the medieval times, you had oracles to make sense of the future, or foreseers, and all these mystic attempts of making sense of the future. In modernity, you could say, so when the modern state came up, we had a number of academics, a number of scholars that have been developing an interest. So if you go back into the first systematic debates on uncertainty and risk, we have Frank Knight in the 1920s, who was questioning our ability to infer from the past, from statistics, to the future. Because individual decisions in economic life are unique and unpredictable, and probabilistic instruments are of not much help. We have a more sectoral view of Charles Perrow, for instance, who has been looking into highly complex technological systems, and has also realized or argues that we have incomplete knowledge because of the interconnectedness and the complexity of such high-risk technologies, for instance, like nuclear power stations and similar issues. Then we have the more societal view, Ulrich Beck, of course, about debound the technological catastrophic risks that are created by modern society. Nuclear power again was one of the triggered by Chernobyl's analysis or by Three Mile Island, by different accidents. But he has been expanding this in his later arguments, talking about terrorism, financial crisis, climate change. So a lot of difficulties to make sense of the future by means of sort of established risk instruments. Then we, not a very strong academic, but Rumsfeld is probably most famous, and his quote of the unknown unknowns that we can only know from hindsight, and the known unknowns which are sort of too complex. We know that something, we know about the fact that we don't know, we can't predict certain things because they're just too complex. And more recently, was Mr. Taleb, who has been talking about black swan events at the tail ends of probabilistic distributions. So we haven't, academics have been looking into this notion of uncertainty and have identified that it is something that societies need to deal with, and that is a problem. In this, a lot of this research has been triggered by this illusion of control that has been developing with the advances in technology and in science in the 19th and 20th century. So there are a number of commentators like Ian Hacking, who's been looking into how the Victorian England has used the senses to tame uncertainty, to tame certain social risks, like old age risk, health risks. So he's been sort of describing how data was systematically analyzed and collected to predict, to establish some kind of laws of social life and society. Bernstein has written a wonderful book on the development of probability theory and the rise of the insurance industry in the 19th century, showing that the risk instruments have been emerging and advancing at a faster pace. So there's so this is more the control narrative that you could sort of juxtapose to the uncertainty narrative. And then we have Mike Power, who's been talking about the risk management of everything, how public policymakers have increasingly been resorting to probabilistic risk instruments like floodnets, for instance, as we'll see, borrowing it from the private sector practices, and that this is sort of fitting well with his idea of an ordered society, because everything is measurable and predictable. And then we have Henry Rothstein, who has also been observing the spread of risk instruments in government as a tool of rationalizing governments. And that one policy field after the other is being colonized by this rationalizing force of governments. So we have this sort of different. So we have this illusion of control. You could say the modern state emerging as a key risk manager. In society, first with the social risks, then environmental risks, security risks, disaster risks. So we have an ever-expanding role of the state in risk management, and then we have, opposed to that, this complexity and uncertainty arguments, and the difficulties, for instance, that Beck argues that these old modern institutions have in dealing with this uncertainty. And this is particularly problematic for states, because part of their legitimacy draws on being able to manage the risk to the populations. So Hood has argued that managing risk always is also linked with blame attribution. So if something goes wrong, someone needs to be blamed, because in modernity you don't have this easy excuse of saying whatever the flood is an act of God, but you look into who didn't invest in flood defenses, who didn't invest in risk instruments. So there's a lot of political institutional risk as well. We have this sort of macro sociological trend maybe of that more affluent societies are more sensitive towards potential harm and the incidence of potential harm, and then we have sort of in the more political dimension, we have increasing accountability measures on policymakers. So all this is kind of a toxic cocktail, which makes it so important for governments to find ways of managing uncertainty and to deal with uncertainty. So here I put the undoing of George W. Bush after Katrina to sort of highlight a little bit the political risk associated with disaster management or poor disaster management. So, this is not an exclusive list of how we can deal with uncertainty, but broadly there are two different sort of ideas that I have been exploring how states manage uncertainty. On the one hand, risk-based governance, and on the other hand, the promotion of resilience. So risk-based governance is still tied a little bit to this idea that we can actually identify and make explicit and reduce uncertainty as our instruments advance in terms of advances in computing technology, and advances in modeling and all these things. So there's the idea that we narrow down the uncertainty, we reduce the uncertainty, and then based on that we can see where we have to invest once we can have a better look into the future. So there's a lot of literature out there. So once the Cabinet Office has a national risk register, in many other countries in Europe, the German, there's a federal agency for risk assessment. They also have developed risk analytical tools like risk registers, is sort of trying to understand which risks are most likely, which have the highest impact. The OECD has been looking into risk and regulation as well, promoting risk assessment, hazard assessment, risk evaluation, risk management, risk communication, that all these tools need to be used for effective governance. And then we have the resilience idea, which is departing, with this definition, but most radically is departing from this idea that we can anticipate risks completely. So what we have to do is to improve the ability of societies to withstand shocks and to recover and adapt quickly to changes. And here again we have, most recently there was a publication of how to make EMU more resilient. So this is, you can see that how this idea of resilience, which is originally from psychology, from child psychology for instance, has been moving into the social science dimension. And we have disaster governance, the HIOBO framework for action from the UN is also strongly focusing on building resilient communities. And the OECD has also been promoting this idea of resilience. So we have, there's a lot of interest in these two concepts at national and at the international level. So given this idea that all states, all democratic states, need to somehow manage uncertainty because otherwise there's a lot of political and institutional risk, and given that there's sort of the international organizations pushing for all this, how are they implemented in different countries? I was asking myself, and then why are they implemented in different ways? And my argument is basically a classical institutionalist, neo-institutionalist approach. So I was looking into how certain procedures, procedural characteristics, certain norms that underlie nations, different government systems, how they can cope or deal with uncertainty, how this concept of uncertainty can be reconciled, and how the different instruments are deployed in different countries. So the first case I was actually partly from a PhD, so slightly outdated. Anyway, so the overall setting is that flood management is a major problem. Across the EU, there are some comparative, some historical data where you can see that a lot of floods have been happening, major floods, for instance 24 major floods within 15 years compared to 23 major floods in 40 years. So that's having happened across Europe. And then there's a sort of a more general paradigm shift across different countries towards from building defenses, trying to channel rivers, into giving rivers more room and space, into using anticipatory policy instruments, because this is one way of dealing with uncertainty. So they are trying to assess the risk and understand better what's going to happen. So there are a few examples for that. For instance, the Floods Directive from 2007 is arguing that risk maps, which is one of the key instruments where you can see, where you have a map and you can, different blue colors indicate statistically how often certain areas are being potentially inundated. So the Floods Directive argues that risk maps are a valuable basis for priority setting and for technical, financial, political decisions regarding flood management. DEFRA is saying that we need the risk evidence-based, the national assessment of flood risk. It's an annual exercise in Britain, and that this will influence flood risk management. And in Germany, it's the same, where you have the same sort of promotion of risk assessments are essential for a targeted forward-looking risk management. So, on the basis of that, one could ask whether there's convergence around risk-based governance of flooding. But when you look a bit closer at the instruments, it's different. So we have in Britain the definition of risk management objectives in flooding is very different from Germany. So in Britain there are outcome measures, and basically what they say is we move hundreds, and within a certain time period, the government is going to move 100,000 properties from a higher to relatively lower risk level through different means. So they do their annual or biannual risk assessment, and they see how many properties are still in that category, and in that after the interventions such as flood defense investments, increased resilience measures, and water retention instruments have been constructed or undertaken. And not only that, but when you undertake these measures, they have to comply to quite a ambitious cost-benefit ratio. And then we have a concrete risk instrument, flood risk maps that draw certain flood zones. And the interesting thing in England is that they are drawn disregarding any protective effects of flood defenses. So the flood zones, the inundation that happens under certain statistical scenarios, they don't take into account the flood defense. They just completely ignore it. So that's which is sort of implicitly saying that these defenses, there's uncertainty in their ability to protect you. So what they don't do, and they don't give any safety promise. And by ignoring the flood defenses, they also communicate that the protection is uncertain. In Germany, it's a very different story. They also use risk-based instruments, but they use it to define a safety threshold. So there's a reference value that the population has to be protected against flood events that happen statistically once in 100 years. And this is something that is in the law, and in principle, while the citizens can't go to the courts to ask for it, it's sort of a guidance for the implementing authorities. It's the HQ 100 standard. And if you look at the risk maps, the flood zones are drawn taking into account the effects of flood defenses. So we have clear definition. We have a safety promise, you could say, and even the certainty of protection is implied in those instruments. So very, very different. I mean, they're using probabilistic instruments. They are saying once in 100 years the standard for protection, but it's a completely different story. Yeah? So I looked into different institutional variables. If you look at the German constitution, there's a lot of talk about the state protecting the population. If you look at the British state as it has evolved under since the 1980s, 1990s, first of all, there's no written constitution, and there's an orientation, an outward-looking orientation that sees the state as competing on the world stage with other countries. So it's a very economic logic, and we have this sort of added transparency pressures in the UK, which are a result of hostile media. So it's a bit harder to identify the norms that are underlying the British system, but it's more about it's this sort of neoliberal model of the state. I will leave it like this now. And then we have different procedural characteristics. So in England, in the UK, we have new public management, an audit society, and target culture, and all these outcome-oriented approach to bureaucracy. And in Germany, we have a highly juridified, legalistic public administration. And this has direct implications for the type of risk-based management. So in Germany, if you look at the can't actually read much, but anyway, the protective state is, for instance, reflected in the flood management itself, in some of the legal text. So the state, for instance, is defined as being responsible for the duty of care, it's Daseinsvorsorge in German, and individuals are only managing residual risks. So first comes the state, then comes the individual. And flood management is a highest order public good. So that's the protective state also. In England, if you look at the basic strategic documents in flood management, you see that they are saying the biggest issue in flood management is economics, so cost-benefit ratio and these things. And then there's an element of blame here. The Environment Agency is the one at the front line if flooding occurs. So there's a bit more, there's exposure to blame games, much more. The actors on the ground are much more aware of the exposure to blame attribution. And if you now look at the risk-based management and the implications, we have this HQ 100, the 100 years protection standard in Germany, which is basically means that given that the life expectancy in Germany is below 100 years, that you are not supposed to experience any flood. In reality, obviously, people experience them, but statistically speaking, you're protected. And in terms of regulations, that's the aim at least. And then they're also saying that if you differentiate standards between different parts of the population, in different areas, different regions, this is politically and legally problematic because the Constitution says everyone deserves the same level of protection. So that's highly problematic for the public administration to say, okay, given that you have a big house right next to the river, and if you take a risk-based approach, you say you always multiply the probability with the value at risk. And then there's someone else who has a small flat somewhere else, or just a small cottage. In Germany, it's legally problematic to protect the house more than the little cottage. And so that's a different, very different. And in England, if you look at the outcome measures, you have the emphasis of the cost-benefit ratio and this sort of easy to measure performance shifting of a certain number of houses from higher to a lower risk category. In terms of proceduralism or procedures, one of my interview partners told me that the jurists and the people with law degrees in Germany, they cannot step back from the binary conceptualizing between this area is safe and this is not safe. This is in danger. So they need to have clarity for their work. If they go to court, if they develop norms, if they don't develop legislation. So if you start saying something like, yeah, you know, we have a flood defense here, but it may be topped over, and then it's very problematic for them to process that. So the HP 100 is a legally defensible type of standard. It's well established and in use, it has been in use historically, and it fulfills the state's duty to protect. So whereas if you start regulating in other risk zones that are less likely to be inundated, for instance, there's a fear of the judicial review process. In the UK, this managerialism is reflected in this performance outcome measures. So you know, that's it. Rather than so there's some measurable numeric category that can be easily scrutinized. So that's a different type of approach. To security governance is shorter. I haven't done that much work on it. If I just compare the security strategy, the main documents. So in the UK, if you look at the case in the security study, we have a recognition of uncertainty. So we're entering an age of uncertainty. We cannot predict every risk, as in unpredictable. In France, it's similar. The world is not necessarily more dangerous, but it has become more unstable, more unforeseeable. So there's this idea of impossibility of prediction. What do we do? And one response is for resilience. I should have taken a different color. Let's see. I can hardly read it myself. So in the UK, I just picked a few quotes to illustrate the point. The security strategy is saying the government cannot alone protect people from all consequences of society, of disasters. Human and social resilience, often at community level, will continue to be crucial for ensuring British citizens' future security and well-being. And then they're saying citizens should be able to go about their business without fear and with a reasonable assurance of safety. So they are already limiting again. They're already saying we don't do what we can't do. And then they're also saying wider knowledge of risk. So if you have a risk register where you can see different potential risks, will enable communities to prepare better. We will therefore publish on a regular basis the National Level Risk Register. So here's an emphasis on community, individual resilience and responsibilizing citizens, and sort of defining the limits of governance and of the state. In France, resilience refers to the capabilities of public authorities and the French society to respond to a major crisis and rapidly restore normal functioning. And the means through which this should be achieved is increased means and methods of surveillance and better response capabilities of public authorities. So, you know, here we have the state playing the main role. And the citizens, which play a key role in the British system, in the British strategy, they are just mentioned that one idea would be to develop a national security voluntary service. So every young French man, so in Louvain, they have to do 1 year of this national security voluntary service. So that's more a civic duty collective approach compared to the British approach, which is also on individual and community resilience. So here we have a more protective and central role of the state again. So, if you look across international organizations and the European Union, for instance, these two concepts can be found across different policy sections, different policy fields, as a means to deal with future disasters and future risks. But what I found is that how they are defined and conceptualized, how they are practiced, these instruments and these norms, how they are defined, that is largely shaped by institutional factors. So we have blame avoidance, blame sensitivity in the UK, and this idea of defining the limits of what the state can do and responsibilizing citizens and communities versus much stronger promises of protection. We found in Germany and France. I mean, that doesn't mean that Germany and France deliver these promises, but at least they define them ambitiously. So these factors ultimately define how the limits of governance are defined and who can be held responsible if something goes wrong. If the British government is always saying, well, we can't protect you, we can't protect you, we can't protect you, or we have told you that you are at a risk zone and that the flood defense will not be able to protect you. Then in principle, I mean, obviously in political dynamics after a crisis, it doesn't work out like this as easily. Then you can shift and deflect the blame game. So the question is also how sustainable are different models of managing uncertainty. So financially, for instance, this H2-100 standard is of course very expensive. Politically, is it possible to really shift responsibilities to the citizens? Are they capable of? Are they willing to accept that? There's obviously also some pressure for convergence. EU floods directive, so every country actually has to introduce certain risk measures. Then there's this sort of expert consensus that uncertainty governance requires new modes of governance. Then there's the question: are these really models that apply? That, once you have this institutional setting, does it sort of lead to some kind of national model or style of managing uncertainty, or is there cross-sectoral variation? And there's one book on risk management in the UK by Christopher Hood and others. It shows how mad dogs and mad cows, different sort of sectors are actually managing risk in different ways. And then obviously there's the question what's happening in Ireland, which I cannot answer myself. Is it a state that tries to responsibilize citizens? Do they promise safety? How are blame games played out? I mean, I know that there were a couple of floods here in the last decade, and what consequences these blame games had. And thank you very much.